A very warm welcome from my side to all of you. My name is Andreas Novy. I'm professor at the Vienna University of Economics and Business and president of the International Polanyi Society. I have the honor to facilitate this event. We are here in the Wappensaal, one of the representative spaces of the City Hall of Vienna, built around the time Karl Polanyi was born, 1886. It was the beginning of fin de siècle, which made Vienna a world city, a cosmopolitan center of intellectual and artistic life. Karl Polanyi himself spent most of the first decades of his life in Budapest, a modern city in a peripheral country. After the First World War, he returned to Vienna. The city was then ruled by social democracy, and Red Vienna became a symbol of a reformist project that gave dignity to its inhabitants, not only the middle classes and the cosmopolites, but also the working class and the former excluded. Kari Polanyi-Levitt, daughter of Karl Polanyi and Ilona Tuchinska, was born in Red Vienna in 1923. She left the city in 1934 due to Austro-fascism, but she continued her attachment to her place of birth. And it was her insistence that first in 2018 the International Karl Polanyi Society was founded. Founded at the Institute for Multi-Level Governance and Development at WU Vienna. And Kari Polanyi is the honorary president of our society. And in 2021, due to the initiative of Bernhard Kittel, professor at University of Vienna, 3 universities, the University of Vienna, Central European University, and WU Vienna, set up the Vienna Karl Polanyi Visiting Professorship. Together with Vienna Adult Education, an old institution of popular education which had Karl Polanyi as one of its teachers, and supported by the Vienna Chamber of Labor and the City of Vienna, we will invite a distinguished scholar as visiting professor every semester. The first visiting professor will be honored today. The Vienna Karl Polanyi Visiting Professorship brings outstanding international scholars to Vienna to deepen our understanding of the ongoing transformations, a challenge which gained in importance with the pandemic that has changed our lives. While the Austrian school of Ludwig Mises and Friedrich Hayek has led to an overtly simplistic understanding of market economies and has increased inequality and social polarization over the last decades, the Hungarian-Austrian Viennese citizen of the world, Karl Polanyi, has dedicated his life to promoting economic systems that serve human cooperation and solidarity, to put the economy in its place. And this place is to sustain a good life for all, but as we know today, without trespassing planetary boundaries. A huge challenge, and a challenge that has motivated our first visiting professor, Nancy Fraser, as well. But more about this in a few minutes. Before, we have 4 welcome addresses by the International Karl Polanyi Society and the 3 organizing universities. I will start with the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Professor Sigrid Stagl is full professor at the Institute for Ecological Economics at WU. She was program director of the master program Social Ecological Economics and Policy, is director of the Competence Center of Sustainability, Transformation and Responsibility, and currently chair of the Department of Socioeconomics. She has published widely in the field of human behavior, sustainable work, the impact of financialization on the environment, and social ecological transformation. She will give her welcome address in the name of Edeltraud Hanapi-Ecker, Rector of Vienna University of Economics and Business. Professor Stagl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening and a very warm welcome. Our very disciplines we come from. And therefore we bring these insights back into our disciplines and thereby hopefully improving the insights and knowledge in economics, sociology, and the other disciplines. So this is our Department of Socioeconomics, and this is how we see markets in today's world. We do this in research, we do this in teaching. We have two master's programs, the master's program in socioeconomy, which is a German language program, and the English language program that our colleague Andreas Novy just mentioned, the socio-ecological economics. And it's really the socio-ecological economics notion of understanding the economy, which is sort of what brings us together. Ideally, we would like to call it economics, but well, it's the embedded vision of the economy being embedded in society and being embedded in the biophysical sphere. This is where we start with. And this is something probably that also unites us tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to tonight's keynote speech, but also to the other contributions. A very warm welcome on behalf of the Vienna University of Economics and Business.
Thank you very much, Sigrid Stagl. Bernhard Kittel is Professor of Economic Sociology at the University of Vienna. He was Deputy Dean for Research at the Faculty of Economic Sciences and is currently Director of the Austrian Corona Panel project. He works at the intersection of sociology, political science, and economics, currently contributing to the fields of labor markets, justice attitudes, voting, and collective decisions. Recent papers have been published widely, including in journals like Social Science Research, Experimental Economics, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. Professor Kittel, we are looking forward to your welcome address.
Thank you very much. Dear Nancy Fraser, honorable speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen, the Dean of the Faculty of Business Economics and Statistics of the University of Vienna, Gerd Stolger, has kindly delegated the task of saying a few words of welcome to me. About 1.5 years ago, having been Vice Dean of Research at that time, I approached the Chamber of Labor asking whether they were interested in sponsoring a new guest professorship at our faculty. The professorship should take up and reinterpret the heritage of social scientific thinking of the times in which Vienna could pride itself of being one of the centers of the arts and sciences in Europe and beyond, before this vibrant intellectual life was wiped out by Austro-Fascism and the Nazi regime. We soon agreed that Polanyi personifies the idea that we had in mind. Also, a guest professorship to the honor of Polanyi is a perfect complement to the Paul Lazarsfeld guest professorship at the Faculty of Social Sciences. This focus also provides a welcome addition to the 2 guest professorships which have already been installed at my own faculty. One, funded by the Austrian National Bank, aims at fostering financial economics in Austria. The other, funded by the Vienna Economic Chamber, is intended to infuse new life to thinking in the spirit of Friedrich August von Hayek. Out of these initial reflections was born the idea to engage in a joint endeavor with the Vienna University of Economics and the Central European University, which has just experienced what it means to be exposed by an illiberal political regime. Given our ambition to cooperate between the 3 universities hosting the social sciences in Vienna, the city of Vienna enthusiastically joined the project as a second sponsor. This cooperation with the city of Vienna resulted also in the recruitment of a further partner, the Vienna Community College. In the 1920s and 1930s, this institution has been a recourse for social democratic and Jewish scholars who were kept out of or banned from the University of Vienna. I am very happy about this partner who, I'm convinced, will foster the exchange between academia and the wider society even more. For purely administrative convenience, we channel the funding from the city of Vienna to the Vienna University of Business and Economics, and the funding of the Chamber of Labor to the University of Vienna, while maintaining the spirit of community in all practical respects in joint team. With Nancy Fraser, we are delighted to welcome a scholar who is not only well acquainted with the work of Karl Polanyi, but who can, as a political philosopher, also lay some fundamental groundwork for the further development of the guest professorship. Nancy Fraser, once again, many thanks for joining us here. I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation. I'm also delighted to announce the virtual presence today of the person who is the designated holder of the next Polanyi guest professorship, to be located at the University of Vienna in the autumn of this year, Fred Bloch from the University of California, Davis. Fred Bloch, many thanks for joining us today. I'm looking forward to welcoming you in autumn of this year, hopefully. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bernhard Kittel. Livio Mattei is Provost of Central European University and a Professor of Higher Education Policy. He taught at universities in Romania, Hungary, and conducted applied policy research for a broad range of institutions, including the World Bank, UNESCO, and the European Commission. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the American University of Central Asia and serves at the editorial boards of the Internationalization of Higher Education Journal and the European Journal of Higher Education. His primary area of expertise include university governance, funding, internationalization of higher education, academic freedom, and university autonomy. Professor Mattei, who is the first speaker besides me present in the Wappensaal, we are looking forward to your welcome address.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It is good to be back to the City Hall, although there is not too many of us now in the room, but I know that there are many colleagues online, and I am bringing warm greetings to all of those who are here and all those who are online, colleagues from Austrian, but also, as I understand, Hungarian universities, and also from a Greek university and from the Polanyi Society. Now, speaking of Hungarian and Austrian universities, my university, Central European University, is probably the only one that is Austrian and Hungarian, Austro-Hungarian, although I should say more and more Austrian and less Hungarian due to circumstances that are known to all of us. I would not try to draw a parallel between the personal trajectory of Karl Polanyi and the institutional trajectory of CEU, moving from or between the two capitals and then further on. But what I would like to do is to thank everybody who played a role in the establishment of this chair. This is a great initiative, and we at CEU are very happy to be part of it. And I'm saying this because I think there is a certain neglect in several disciplines that were in the academic areas that were represented by Karl Polanyi. There is a certain neglect of his contributions, and I very much hope that the establishment of this chair will help to take forward his intellectual legacy for the benefit of the education of new generations of students, but also for research in these areas. And let me just perhaps illustrate with two short examples what do I mean by a certain neglect with regard to the contributions and the relevance today of the work of Karl Polanyi. I am probably one of the few in this audience, physical and online, who is not an economist. I studied philosophy in Romania in the early 90s, in the early 80s, I'm sorry, even longer time ago. And at that time, that was a very good school of philosophy, and we read everybody who was relevant in various philosophical areas, including Hungarian authors. So we read not only Lukács this was again in the 80s of the last century, but also Agnes Heller, who was still a young philosopher at that time. We never read Polanyi. Polanyi was never mentioned during my undergraduate studies in philosophy over 4 years. It was a discovery for me afterwards to realize how much it has contributed not only to political economy, but also to other disciplines. So this is one example of what I call a relative neglect of his contributions. Another one which made me think a lot about in the process of establishing this chair. My university is a Central European university, and we have been established with roots in the intellectual legacy of Central and Eastern Europe. And we speak quite a lot still today on our campus about Karl Popper, for sure, about other scholars and intellectuals. We don't speak a lot about Karl Polanyi, and not a lot outside economics and political science and international relations, in particular those who deal with international political economy. And that is quite surprising because, in a way, intellectually, Karl Popper is one of the founding references of Central European University, if not a founding father, which obviously he is not. So once again, I think this is a wonderful initiative. I would like to thank everybody who contributed to establishing it. I would also like to greet the two first holders of the chair, and not at the end of everything, I would like to thank the city for very generously supporting this initiative. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Livio Mattei. I just want to add, one of the few persons present here in this room is also Carsten Schneider from Central European University, and he was one of the co-organizers of this event. So thank you very much, Carsten, for your contribution as well. Yeah, and another speaker before coming to the inauguration in itself. The last virtual guest in the welcome addresses is Mariama Cantonato. She is assistant professor in political sociology at the University of the Aegean in Lesbos, Greece. She has been a postdoctoral fellow at Humboldt University, at the Kolleg Postwachstumsgesellschaft, at Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, and at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. In 2019, she published co-edited the book Karl Polanyi's Political and Economic Thought, a Critical Guide, together with Christopher Holmes and Garrett Dale. She is member of the board of the International Karl Polanyi Society. Professor Cantonato, we are looking forward to your welcome address.
Good morning or good evening to everyone. On behalf of the International Karl Polanyi Society and as a member of its board, I would like to welcome Professor Nancy Fraser, a renowned international scholar in social sciences, as our first visiting professor in the frame of our new project beginning in the spring semester 2021, Karl Polanyi Visiting Professorship, a cooperation of the University of Vienna, of the Central European University, the International Karl Polanyi Society and the Volkshochschule Wien. The International Karl Polanyi Society is a scientific academic association inspired by the work of Karl Polanyi, aiming to enrich and broaden research in the many directions he has opened. Beyond its scientific character, the International Karl Polanyi Society is also an association of engaged citizens, teachers, activists, journalists, and professionals from diverse policy fields who draw on the rich intellectual, moral, and political legacy of Polanyi and the public debates he has inspired. In line with Polanyi's orientations, the Society strives for an extension of democratic principles to social organization through both economic democratization and political participation, and the balance between the individual right to choose and the societal necessity of a democratic polity to create infrastructure that enable freedom for all. In an age of rapid technological advances and digitalization, Polanyi's concerns about the humankind's futures threatened by industrial civilization are set again. Commodification, a process well explained by Polanyi, together with dominant economistic and managerial approaches to modern social problems, threaten today such public goods as healthcare and education, and weaken the welfare state and democratic citizenship. In the spirit of Polanyi's ideas on the importance of society's own experiments, the Society invites collectivities, trade union members, activists and citizens to experiment with social innovations that go beyond the current market society and focus on social, ecological, cultural and economic needs rather than profit priorities. The Society's aim is also to reconsider the political sphere as the domain of the common good, public dialogue and democratic social organization. With that said, on behalf of the International Karl Polanyi Society, I would like to warmly welcome Professor Nancy Fraser to inaugurate the Karl Polanyi Visiting Professorship and wish her a fruitful collaboration.
Thank you very much, Professor Cantonato. In the name of the Mayor of Vienna, Michael Ludwig, Veronica Kaup-Hasler, she's present here, will inaugurate the first Vienna Karl Polanyi visiting professorship granted to Professor Nancy Fraser. Veronica Kaup-Hasler is cultural and theatre scholar, dramaturg, cultural manager, and lecturer at several art universities in Europe. Previous positions include the Basel Theatre, the Wiener Festwochen, the artistic directorship of the Theaterformen Festival in Hanover and Brunswick. She was a member of various artistic juries from 2008 to 18, member of the University Board of the University of Music and Performing Arts, Vienna. From 2006 to 2017, she has been director of the Contemporary Arts Festival Steirischer Herbst in Graz. And since 2018, she has been Executive City Councillor for Cultural Affairs and Science of the city of Vienna. Veronica Kaup-Hasler, we are very happy that you are here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Dear Professor Fraser, dear Professor Dörre, dear Professor Novy, dear Professor Stagel, Professor Kittel, dear Professor Mattei, dear Professor Cantonato, and dear Professor Aulenbacher, distinguished guests wherever you are. It is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you on behalf of the city of Vienna. I'm honored to inaugurate the newly founded Polanyi Visiting Professorship here in Vienna. Please welcome together with me Nancy Fraser, the first scholar to hold the professorship. Let's make it like this. In his book, The Great Transformation, Karl Polanyi focused not only on the rising importance of machines in the economy and how the industrial organization became more and more efficient, but he also took a close look at what these changes did to society, how the role of the state changed, and finally, how capitalism in its present form evolved. Today, most of the figures of capitalist thought are close to what his brother Michael Polanyi called tacit knowledge. This principle roots deeply in us, and they are affirmed day by day up to the point where they became normal and side effects are just commonly accepted. Karl Polanyi argued that the rise in productivity doesn't come cost-free. Tremendous inequalities, unemployment, business cycles, and other side effects put high costs and pressure on societies. The city of Vienna is a social democratic gravitation center in Austria and in Europe. Side effects of capitalism were tackled head-on, and since the early 1920s, social housing is part of our city culture. The distribution of land and real estate play a significant role in Polanyi's analysis as in Vienna's housing policies. The city of Vienna is by far the biggest landowner in the city, offers 440,000 apartments and houses, so 60% of the population live at reduced rent in so-called Gemeindebauten, social housings, all over the city. The market power of the city of Vienna in the real estate market is significant, and it shows that state intervention and regulation can, if not solve the problem, so at least ease the pain on a regional level. As a result, we are voted the most livable city in the quality of living city ranking, and that, believe it or not, is in the end also linked to Karl Polanyi's work. 77 years after the publication of The Great Transformation, it is still in print. It hasn't lost its appeal, and this is why the city of Vienna decided to honor one of Austria's greatest economists, who is not a representative of the Austrian School of Economics, which he criticized very vocally as a senior editor of the magazine Der Österreichische Volkswirt, the Austrian Economist. When we started to come up with the program, only a small number of people knew that Wuhan is a city in China. The words and phrases pandemic, social distancing, herd immunity, vaccination, quota, and many more were not in anyone's active vocabulary. Since then, the world faced a very rapid and dramatic transformation. Suddenly, social life went from a healthy and necessary activity to being a hazard. The social impact of COVID-19 will be tremendous in the years to come, and I want to encourage as many economists, sociologists, philosophers, academics, and intellectuals to work on this transformation, as it will have a significant influence on the next decades. Not only that we need to bring down unemployment and start our lives again, but to come up with the alternative forms of societal and industrial organization. We will need the ideas of scholars like Nancy Fraser and many others in order to overcome this crisis. Therefore, a warm welcome to Vienna.
Thank you very much, Veronica Kaup-Hasler. We now come to the Laudatio in honor of Nancy Fraser. It will be delivered by Professor Brigitte Aulenbacher. She is Professor of Sociological Theory and Social Analysis, head of the Department for the Theory of Society and Social Analysis at the Institute of Sociology at the Johannes Kepler University in Linz. Her research areas are the analysis of capitalism, sociology of care, sociology of work, and gender studies. She co-edited several special issues and books on Karl Polanyi, including Capitalism and Transformation Movements and Counter-Movements in the 21st Century, as well as Karl Polanyi, The Life and Works of an Epochal Thinker, which is also available for download at the website of the IKPS. She is Vice President of the International Karl Polanyi Society, and in 2019 she received, together with colleagues, the Kurt Rothschild Award for her work on Karl Polanyi. Professor Aulenbacher, she is also present. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this warm welcome, and good evening to everybody. Perhaps for some of you, good morning or good afternoon. It is a great honor and an equally great challenge to deliver this speech in recognition of Nancy Fraser's work. And I'm delighted to be doing so on behalf of the International Karl Polanyi Society. The last time my colleagues and I from the International Karl Polanyi Society met Nancy Fraser was 2 years ago. It was at an event at Bennington College in Vermont on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the publication of Karl Polanyi's magnum opus, The Great Transformation, which he had written at the college. It perhaps came as no surprise to those who know Nancy Fraser when she said at that event that she would in fact consider herself as Marxist or Marxian rather than Polanyian. It would have probably seemed just an unsurprising had she said, for example, that she considered herself a feminist. At the time, we had no idea that a visiting professorship in Karl Polanyi's name would be created in Vienna, the city that had such an impact on his life and work, and that we would have the tremendous honor and pleasure of welcoming Nancy Fraser as our first visiting professor. But how does this fit together? An internationally renowned author and researcher who has contributed to the ongoing rediscovery of Karl Polanyi's work, yet who epitomizes so much more. In this address, I will try to illustrate how her rich work drives the discussion forward, the discussion which we seek to encourage in the spirit of Polanyi and in the light of this year's motto, Counter-Movements, putting the economy in its place. Intellectual traditions. Nancy Fraser is a social philosopher and effortlessly crosses the boundaries between disciplines. At times, we encounter thoughts and ideas related to political science, at other times to sociology. Alongside her philosophical reflections, what remains constant, however, is that her ideas are always rooted in long-standing intellectual traditions. As the internationally renowned representative of critical theory that she is, Nancy Fraser has always sought to engage with Jürgen Habermas. Her theory of justice developed out of the controversy with Axel Honneth. Her analysis of capitalism and society, in turn, is strongly influenced by Marx. Finally, we find Polanyi's work inscribed in her theory of the society, as well as reference to Antonio Gramsci. In her conversation in Critical Theory with Rahel Yegi, she brings all these distinct intellectual traditions together. So, can we in fact identify a common theme? In my view, her ultimate objective, as she spelled out with Axel Honneth in the tradition of critical theory, is to conceptualize capitalist society as a totality. Her aim is to discern the social structures and interrelationships that cause the ecological, economic, social, cultural, and political crisis we have witnessed over the past decades. Understanding this development of society, the feminist Nancy Fraser explains, requires a broadening of the perspective on capitalism and society in two ways. Firstly, we need an analysis of capitalism that regards not only class inequalities, but also the relations of gender and race as constitutive of this social formation. According to Nancy Fraser, capitalism as such cannot be separated from sexism and racism. In this sense, capitalism is neither compatible with the idea which Nancy Fraser introduced to the discussion in the early 1990s, the organization of society according to the universal caregiver, a conception of humanity which aspire in keeping with anti-poverty, anti-exploitation, equality of respect, and many more, for all people to be able to care for themselves and for others. Nor is capitalism conceivable without colonialism and slavery, a circumstance that is currently being condemned by the Black Lives Matter movement, and has led Nancy Fraser to speak of racial capitalism. In my understanding, Nancy Fraser seeks to develop a feminist and intersectional theory of justice and an analysis and critique of capitalism that traces the relations of dominance and causes of crisis to the economy and the relation between economy, ecology, and society, while at the same time pursuing emancipatory change. The theory of justice. Nancy Fraser's theory of justice, developed at the end of the last and the beginning of this century, is highly relevant and topical, as we shall see in the following. In her widely acknowledged concept of social justice, she combines what has been separated historically, the topics of redistribution and recognition, commonly more closely associated with the old left or the new left, she names, under the label of class politics or identity politics, respectively. And she reflects on this issue of the representation of people in a globalized world, the nation-state-based structure of which does not provide for the participation of all people, even in democracies. Nancy Fraser's three-dimensional concept of social justice focuses on economy, culture, and politics as the domains that structure and determine the practice of social life. A just society, according to Fraser, can be measured by the extent to which the norm of participatory parity of all members of society has been established. The path to such a society is marked by struggles for redistribution, recognition, and representation, in the course of which marginalized and discriminated groups in society have to claim their right to just participation in the face of institutional obstacles. Fraser's perspectivist dualism states that questions of redistribution always also entail a dimension of recognition and vice versa. And representation is without alternative in a democratic society. To quote her, the political sphere serves as a kind of stage on which the struggles for redistribution and recognition take place, and where the question of who is entitled to make which demands is determined, and new forms of democratic participation must be developed. The theory of capitalism. With regard to Marx and Polanyi, Nancy Fraser notes that two Karls are better than one. For each of these Karls affords some indispensable insights for understanding capitalist crisis. According to Nancy Fraser, society is suffering from a fundamental contradiction inherent in capitalism. Building on Marx, she defines this contradiction as follows. The accumulation-driven dynamic of the capitalist mode of production destroys the very foundations of social and ecological reproduction on which production relies for its own functioning. Here, her perspective focuses on the relations of ownership, exploitation, and alienation, which subordinate humanity and nature to the logic of capital valuation and accumulation, and which is where the appropriation of surplus value and the wealth redistribution in favor of the 1% takes place. Yet this Karl, Marx, she argues, is too fixated on the inner economic processes. Nancy Fraser considers the other Karl, Polanyi, by contrast, to be the best theorist of crisis of our times. His concept of fictitious commodities, according to which the destructive commodification of land, labor, and money in line with the requirements of the self-regulated markets leads to the demolition of society, so Polanyi. And it explains the more recent ecological, finance, economic, and social and political crises. To some extent, however, Nancy Fraser is at odds with this Karl as well, even though he does address the relation between economy and society. Society seems to remain a black box. Correspondingly, Nancy Fraser's own approach differs. The decision about what is to be organized in a marketized, private, commercial, familial, or state-coordinated form, and in what way this is linked to social inequalities, occurs not only in the economy or in the relation between economy and society, it occurs also in border struggles, her term, that develop along the social institutional order of capitalism and are closely linked to the division of labor. While Polanyi considers history to be the result of a double movement, the movement of the market fundamentalist commodification of land, labor, and money, and the counter-movements through which society seeks to protect itself from the consequences of the market dynamics, Nancy Fraser proposes her concept of a triple movement. It is close to her three-dimensional conception of social justice. This concept includes those social protests and struggles that are neither of the Marxian type, directed against exploitation, nor of the Polanyian type, seeking for protection, but which pursue the goal of emancipation in the sense of recognition, which may be linked to a critique of exploitation and market fundamentalism, but necessarily not so. The analysis of contemporary crisis. Nancy Fraser sparks debate. I would like to illustrate this based on two examples. The first pertains to populism, the second to feminism. With respect to populism, Nancy Fraser emphasizes the path from progressive to reactionary and to hyper-reactionary neoliberalism, not only in the United States. In her view, these developments were and continue to be before, during, and after the financial crisis the cause of economic, ecological, and social crisis and social inequalities and polarizations, while also leading to far-reaching shifts in the relations between capitalism and democracy. Alongside the rise of anti-democratic forces, the latter includes the destabilization of the political institutions which the capitalist market economy relies on for its functioning, given that it does not exist independently from society, as Karl Polanyi made clear. To Nancy Fraser, today's crisis of democracy is a dimension of the capitalist crisis, as neoliberalism is stretched to its limits. Drawing on Gramsci, she speaks of an interregnum in which the old is dying and the new cannot be born, and of an hegemonic gap as well as the struggle to fill it. As regards the chances of managing to form a counter-hegemonic bloc in light of a society shaken by crisis, she provocatively states that the current situation leaves progressive populism as the likeliest candidate. To her, redistribution and recognition are topics through which progressive populism can reach people and thus change conditions, considering the existential social uncertainties felt by large parts of the population and the struggles discriminated groups face to assert their rights. Regarding my second example, to Nancy Fraser, the history of neoliberalism is also one of the co-optation of feminism. Policies of gender inequality in the context of the given economic order have helped only very few women to climb up the social and professional ladder and achieve real success, while the 99% suffer the consequences of the economic, ecological, social, and political crisis. Nancy Fraser has provided inspiring contributions to the debate across a wide range of feminist and intersectional critics of capitalism, always with the objective of reversing the subordination of social, ecological reproduction to economic production. With regard to our motto, this also includes putting the economy in its place instead of, in the words of Karl Polanyi, degrading society to the status of an accessory of the market. The vision for the future. Nancy Fraser's work is pervaded by a holistic view on economic, social, cultural, and political claims to egalitarian distribution and equal recognition and participation. In the last chapter of his main work, entitled Freedom in a Complex Society, Karl Polanyi envisages a society that could be just and free when the utopian experiment of a self-regulating market will be no more than a memory. In this society, the right to non-conformity, Polanyian term, as a form of individual freedom would take center stage just as much as the organization and structuring of society in a way that would break with the structures of privilege and the existing economic organization. Nancy Fraser's vision for the future is one of ecological socialism, in which the centralism of the failed socialist systems is entirely alien, in which the relations of ownership and economic organization are subjected to a radical democratic restructuring, and in which it ultimately becomes a collective decision which growth paths are chosen and how and for what purposes surplus is actually used. When comparing both Karl Polanyi's and Nancy Fraser's conceptions of a just and free socialist society, it turns out that they may have far more in common than is often assumed. Today and in the coming days, we can look forward to being part of some exciting discussions with our very first Karl Polanyi visiting Professorship Nancy Fraser, contributing to the intellectual counter-moves of our time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brigitte Aulenbacher, for this laudatio. This event today is part of a lecture series of Austrian universities, the just mentioned one, plus the Vienna Technical University, and organizations of public adult education. The lecture series is called Counter Movements, in line with the key Polanyian concept. Co-organizers not mentioned yet are the Vienna Adult Education Center and the Linz Adult Education Center, the Chamber of Labor in Upper Austria, the Intercultural Center, the Institute for Applied Development Studies, and the Austrian Society for Political Education. Yeah, and now, dear Nancy Fraser, far away on the other side of the Atlantic, welcome to Vienna. We imagined a different inauguration. We planned it already for October 2020, and then due to the pandemic, we postponed it for one semester. And in this semester, we decided better to have a virtual visiting professor than none. And whatever the future will bring, better to have this in this semester. And so we have a PhD seminar with you that already started. We have these lectures during this week. This is the room where you would have spoken, would you have been here in Vienna. We very much look forward for another opportunity to have you in Vienna physically, but we are very, very happy that this virtual event is taking place today. And the great advantage of the internet is that we have a very international audience coming from all parts of this planet. Before finally giving the floor to you and your keynote speech, just a few additional biographical informations in addition to what Brigitte Aulenbacher has already presented. Nancy Fraser is Henry A. and Louise Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics, as well as Research Fellow at the Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School for Social Research in New York City. She has received various awards and honors, including the American Philosophical Association's Alfred Schutz Prize in 2010, the French Legion of Honor in 2018, the Nessim Abif World Prize from the University of Geneva in 2018, and the Havens Wright Center Award for Lifetime Contribution to Critical Scholarships in 2019 from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She holds honorary doctoral degrees from 6 universities in 5 countries. And she's author of several books, and I just mentioned some of the more recent ones: Feminism for the 99%, the Manifesto, co-authored with Cynthia Arusa and Titi Bhattacharya; Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, co-authored with Rahel Yegi; Fortunes of Feminism, From State-Managed Capitalism to Neoliberal Crisis; and Scales of Justice, Reimagining Political Space in a Globalizing World. Nancy Fraser will today talk about incinerating nature, why global warming is baked into capitalist society. Dear Nancy, we're looking forward to your keynote.
Thank you very, very much, Andreas, and to all of you who have spoken and given me such a warm welcome.
it's truly sad to be sitting here. I'm actually in a hotel room in Alabama where I've been able to see my grandchildren for the first time in over a year. But boy, would I love to be in that beautiful City Hall with all of you in person. I'm extremely impressed by all the interinstitutional cooperation, the various universities, the role of the city, the adult education sphere, and so on. It's kind of a model for what I wish we could do in New York. We certainly have the institutions, but we lack the coordination that you apparently have. It's also great to be part of the, I don't know if we should say rediscovery or reappreciation, a more just appreciation of the importance of the thought of Karl Polanyi. He's someone who made a huge impression on me when I first read him as a college student in the late 1960s, and whom I rediscovered again, teaching him at the New School roughly 10 years ago. And he really insinuated himself into my thinking, so that despite the quote, and it's accurate that Brigitte Aulenbacher mentioned at the Vermont Bennington College conference, where I said I'm not a Polanyian but a Marxist. I think it's not entirely an accurate self-description. It might have, something might have pressed my button at that moment. But I think you'll see as I get into the lecture itself, how much Polanyi is hovering and interwoven with everything I think. So let me thank you, Brigitte and Andreas, all of you in the various institutions, and try to now show you how I have tried to bring at least quasi-Polanyian strands of thinking to understanding the present ecological crisis. And I do think, although I don't speak of this explicitly, I do think that a lot of what I'm about to say could be read as a gloss on the notion of the fictitious commodification of land. So I want to start just by observing something that I think you all already observed, which is that we hear a great deal of talk about the Anthropocene. Many, many powerful voices are invoking that term in order to underline the severity of the present climate crisis. By framing global warming as a new epoch in the historical geology of planet Earth, they are rightly stressing the momentous and world-shattering character of this crisis. And by naming the new epoch after Anthropos, they are rebuking, in an entirely salutary way, those who deny any role to our species in bringing us to this pass. By foregrounding the capacity of human action to destroy the conditions of life on the planet, finally, they are calling on us to act decisively, we humans, to act decisively to safeguard those conditions and to safeguard the Earth itself. So you can see this talk of Anthropocene is a very powerful rhetoric, and it has many, many salutary aspects. And yet, I want to say that there is something profoundly misleading and even diversionary in this choice of terminology. I just, in listening to Brigitte and others, I think we could say it is a profoundly disembedded way of trying to understand climate change, because it's simply not the case that the species Homo sapiens sapiens, as such, is the principal socio-historical driver of global warming. It's not humanity in general that has been bombarding the atmosphere with greenhouse gases for the last 200 years. No, that dubious honor belongs, and okay, here I'll use Marxian language. I'm going to be sort of oscillating back and forth between the two Karls. That dubious honor belongs to the class of profit-driven entrepreneurs and investors who engineered our fossil fuel system of production and transport. But far from acting contingently by chance or by simple greed, they have done so, I'm going to argue, non-accidentally. That is, in accord with the structurally entrenched imperatives of a specific social system. Not humanity in general then, but capitalist society's version of humanity has brought us global warming. Capitalism, in a sense I'm going to define soon, represents, I claim, the socio-historical driver of climate change, and therefore the core institutionalized dynamic that must be dismantled in order to stop it. Eco-politics, I'm going to maintain, must become anti-capitalist. But that's not all. Capitalism, in the sense that I'm going to elaborate, is also deeply implicated in seemingly non-ecological forms of societal injustice, from class exploitation to racial imperial oppression to gender and sexual domination. And capitalism figures centrally too in seemingly non-ecological societal impasses, in crises of care and social reproduction, of finance, supply chains, wages, and work, of dispossession, expulsion, and exclusion of migrants, of governance, militarization, and what's been called de-democratization. Rooted in the same social system that has brought us global warming, these strands of our present crisis are thoroughly entangled with it. So much so that an eco-politics capable of saving the planet cannot proceed in isolation from them. As well as being anti-capitalist then, eco-politics must also be trans-environmental, and I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. Anyway, that's the thesis I want to try to argue here over the course of this lecture and a follow-up that I'll be giving tomorrow. I'm going to argue this thesis on two different levels, which I think complement and reinforce one another. Today, then, I'll make the case in terms of social structure. I'll give a structural argument to the effect that capitalism, rightly understood, harbors a deep-seated ecological contradiction, which inclines it non-accidentally to environmental crisis. But far from standing alone, I claim, that contradiction is entwined with several others, which are equally endemic to capitalism and cannot be adequately addressed in abstraction from them. Now, in the follow-up lecture tomorrow, I'll just mention that I'll be shifting to the plane of history, charting some of the specific forms that capitalism's ecological contradiction has assumed in the various phases of the system's development. And I'll be arguing that contra single-issue environmentalism, this history discloses the pervasive entanglement of eco-crisis and eco-struggle with other strands of crisis and struggle from which they have never been fully separable in the history of capitalism. So in both lectures then, the conclusion is one and the same. And eco-politics for our time must be anti-capitalist and trans-environmental. Well, what does it mean to say that capitalism is the principal socio-historical driver of global warming? At one level, obviously, this claim is empirical, a statement of cause and effect, against the usual vague references to the Anthropocene or anthropogenic climate change. It pins the rap not on humanity in general, but as I said, on the profit-driven class that engineered the fossil fuel system of production and transport that has released a flood of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's a claim I'll defend empirically in tomorrow's lecture when I turn to the historical portion of the argument, but there is more at work here than historical causality. Capitalism, as I understand it, drives global warming non-accidentally by virtue of its very structure. And it's this strong systematic claim and not its weaker empirical cousin that I want to unpack now. But I have to begin by preempting a possible misunderstanding. To say that capitalism drives climate change non-accidentally is not to say that ecological crises occur only in capitalist societies. On the contrary, many pre-capitalist societies have perished as a result of environmental impasses, including some of their own making, as when ancient empires ruined the farmlands on which they depended through deforestation or failure to rotate crops. And in the same way, some self-proclaimed post-capitalist societies have generated severe environmental damage through relentless quotidian coal burning and spectacular one-off disasters such as Chernobyl. Such cases show that ecological devastation is not unique to capitalism. What is unique, however, is the structural character of the link between ecological crisis and capitalist society. Pre-capitalist eco-crises occurred in spite of what I'll call nature-friendly worldviews, and largely thanks to ignorance, failure to anticipate the consequences of deforestation or overplanting. They could have been prevented, and sometimes were, by social learning that prompted shifts in social practice. Nothing in the inherent dynamics of these societies required the practices that spawned the damages. The same is true, I believe, for self-proclaimed post-capitalist societies. Really existing socialisms practiced unsustainable agricultural and industrial regimens, poisoning the land with chemical fertilizers and fouling the air with CO2. Unlike their pre-capitalist predecessors, of course, their practices aligned with worldviews that were not at all nature-friendly, and their actions were shaped by ideological pressures enjoining what they called the development of the forces of production. What is crucial, however, is that neither those worldviews nor those pressures arose from dynamics internal to socialism. Their roots lay rather in the geopolitical soil in which these socialisms germinated, in a world system structured by competition with capitalist societies, by the catch-up extractivist mindset that environment fostered, and by the fossil fuel models of mega industrialization favored by it. Now, I want to be clear that in saying this, I do not at all mean to let the rulers of these societies off the hook. They will remain forever culpable for disastrous decisions made in bureaucratic authoritarian milieus that were saturated with fear and obsessed with secrecy, qualities they deliberately cultivated. The point is rather that nothing in the nature of socialist society as such requires such milieus or such decisions. Absent the prevailing external constraints and internal deformations, such societies could, in principle, develop sustainable patterns of interaction with non-human nature. The same cannot be said, however, for capitalist societies. They are unique among known social systems in entrenching a deep-seated tendency to ecological crisis at their very core. As I shall explain, a systemic ecological contradiction is inscribed in the DNA of capitalist society, anchored in its signature institutional structure and developmental dynamics. As a result, capitalist societies are primed to generate recurrent environmental crises throughout their history. Unlike those of other societies, their ecological impasses cannot be resolved by increased knowledge or by green bona fides. What is required in addition is deep structural transformation. Now, to see why, we have to revisit the concept of capitalism. Contrary to the usual view, capitalism is not an economic system, but something bigger. More than a way of organizing economic production and exchange, it is also a way of organizing the relation of production and exchange to their non-economic conditions of possibility. This is a deeply Polanyian point I'm making. It is well understood in many quarters that capitalist societies institutionalize a dedicated economic realm, the realm of a peculiar abstraction known as value, where commodities are produced on privately owned means of production by exploited waged laborers, and where they are sold on price-setting markets by private firms, all with the aim of generating profits and accumulating capital. What is too often overlooked, however, is that this realm is constitutively dependent on, one could say parasitic on, a host of social activities, political capacities, and natural processes that are defined in capitalist societies as non-economic, accorded no value in this technical sense, and positioned outside the economy. These constitute the economy's indispensable presuppositions. Certainly, commodity production is inconceivable absent the unwaged activities of social reproduction that form and sustain the human beings who perform waged labor. Nor could such production exist apart from the natural processes that assure availability of vital inputs, including raw materials and sources of energy. Neither, finally, would profit or capital be possible without the legal orders, repressive forces, and public goods that underpin private property and contractual exchange. Essential conditions for a capitalist economy, these non-economic instances are not external to capitalism, but integral elements of it. Conceptions of capitalism that omit them are ideological. To equate capitalism with its economy is to parrot the system's own economistic self-understanding, and thus to miss the chance to interrogate it critically. To gain a critical perspective, we must understand capitalism broadly as an institutionalized social order that encompasses not only the economy, but also those activities, relations, and processes that make the economy possible. What is gained from this revision is the ability to examine something crucial, namely the relation established in capitalist societies between the economy and its others, including that vital other known as nature. At its core, this relation is contradictory and crisis-prone. On the one hand, the system's economy is constitutively dependent on nature, both as a tap for production's inputs and as a sink for disposing its waste. At the same time, capitalist society institutes a stark division between the two realms, constructing economy as a field of creative human action that generates value, while positioning nature as a realm of stuff, devoid of value, but infinitely self-replenishing and generally available to be processed in commodity production without any limits. Now, this ontological gulf becomes a raging inferno when capital enters the mix. Capital is a monetized abstraction engineered to self-expand, one that commands capital accumulation without end. The effect is to incentivize owners bent on maximizing profits to commandeer what they consider to be nature's gifts as cheaply as possible, while absolving them of any obligation to replenish what they take and repair what they damage. The damages, in my view, are the flip side of the profits. With their ecological reproduction costs discounted, all the major inputs to capitalist production and circulation are vastly cheapened, not just raw material, energy, and transport, but also labor, as wages fall with the cost of living when capital wrests foodstuffs from nature on the cheap. In every case, capitalists appropriate the savings from cheap inputs in the form of profits, while passing the environmental costs to those who must live with and die from the fallout, including future generations of human beings. So what I'm saying is that capital is more than a relation to labor. It's also a relation to nature, a predatory, extractive relation, which consumes ever more biophysical wealth in order to pile up ever more value, while disavowing what the economists would call ecological externalities. But what also piles up non-accidentally is an ever-growing mountain of eco-wreckage, an atmosphere flooded by carbon emissions, climbing temperatures, crumbling polar ice shelves, rising seas clogged with islands of plastic, mass extinctions, declining diversity, and as we're now discovering to our grave peril, climate-driven migrations of organisms and pathogens, increased zoonotic spillovers of deadly viruses, not to mention superstorms, mega droughts, giant locust swarms, jumbo wildflowers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Systemically primed to free ride on a nature that cannot really self-replenish without limit, capitalism's economy is always on the verge of destabilizing its own ecological conditions of possibility. I think this is another way of talking about the fictitious commodification of land. In any case, here in effect is an ecological contradiction lodged at the heart of capitalist society in the relation the society establishes between economy and nature. Grounded deep in the system's structure, this contradiction is encapsulated in 4 words that begin with the letter D. That is dependence, division, disavowal, and destabilization. In a nutshell, capitalist society makes economy depend on nature while dividing them ontologically, enjoining endless accumulation of value while defining nature as not partaking of it. This arrangement programs economy to disavow the ecological reproduction costs it generates. The effect, as those costs mount exponentially, is to destabilize ecosystems and periodically to disrupt the entire jerry-rigged edifice of capitalist society. Simultaneously kneading and rubbishing nature, capitalism is a cannibal that devours its own vital organs, like a serpent that eats its own tail. Now, the contradiction can also be formulated in a different way, namely in terms of class power. By definition, capitalist societies devolve to capital, or rather to those dedicated to its accumulation, the task of organizing production. It is the class of capitalists whom this system licenses to extract raw materials, generate energy, determine land use, engineer food systems, bioprospect medicinals, and dispose of waste, effectively ceding to them the lion's share of control over air and water, soil and minerals, flora and fauna, forests and oceans, atmosphere and climate. In other words, over all the basic conditions that sustain life on Earth. Capitalist societies thus vest a class that is strongly motivated to trash nature with the power to manage our relations to it. Now, it's true that governments sometimes intervene post hoc to mitigate the damages, but always reactively in the mode of catch-up and without disturbing the owner's fundamental prerogatives. Because they are always a step behind the emitters of greenhouse gases, environmental regulations are easily subverted by corporate workarounds. And because they leave intact the structural divisions that license private firms to organize production, they do not alter the fundamental fact the system gives capitalists motive, means, and opportunity to savage the planet. So it is they, and not humans in general, who have brought us global warming, but not by chance or simple greed. Rather, the dynamic that has governed their actions and led to that outcome is baked into the very institutional structure of capitalist societies. So whichever formulation we start with, the conclusion we reach is the same. Capitalistically organized societies carry an ecological contradiction in their DNA. They are primed to precipitate what we think of as natural catastrophes, which occur periodically but not accidentally throughout their histories. And so these societies harbor a built-in tendency to ecological crisis. They generate ecosystemic vulnerabilities on an ongoing basis as part and parcel of their modus operandi. Although not always acute or even apparent, these vulnerabilities pile up over time until a tipping point is reached and the damage bursts forth into view. I shall consider some historical examples in tomorrow's lecture. Here, though, I've been stressing the structural character of this tendency, and the point is all important, not least for its practical entailments. To say that capitalism's ecological problem is structural is to say that we cannot save the planet without disabling some core defining features of our social order. What is needed first and foremost is to wrest the power to dictate our relation to nature away from the class that currently monopolizes it, so that we can reinvent that relation from the ground up. But that requires dismantling the system that underpins their power, the military forces and property forms, the pernicious ontology of value, and the relentless dynamic of accumulation, all of which work together to drive global warming. Ecopolitics must, in sum, be anti-capitalist. Now, that conclusion is conceptually significant as it stands, but it still doesn't tell the whole story. To complete the picture, we need to consider some additional structural features of capitalist society that also impact nature and the struggles surrounding it. What is crucial here is a point I alluded to earlier, and one that Brigitte mentioned in her earlier words. Nature is neither the only non-economic background condition for a capitalist economy, nor the only site of crisis in capitalist society. Rather, as I already noted in passing, capitalist production also relies on social, reproductive, and political prerequisites. And these arrangements too, as Karl Polanyi would have noted, are also contradictory, no less than the arrangements surrounding nature with which they interact in ways that we ignore at our peril. These relations too must be included in an eco-critical theory and eco-critical politics of capitalist society. Let me first ask you to consider briefly the social reproductive conditions for a capitalist society. Here too, capitalism organizes more than production. In this case, it's about production's relation to the multiple forms of care work performed by communities and families, chiefly, but not only, by women. Sustaining the human beings who constitute labor and forging the social bonds that enable cooperation, care work is indispensable to any system of social provisioning. But capitalism's distinctive way of organizing it is every bit as contradictory as its way of organizing nature. Here too, the system works through splitting. In this case, splitting production off from reproduction and treating the first alone. as a locus of value. The effect is to license economy to free ride on society, to appropriate care work without replenishment, to deplete the energies needed to provide it, and thus to jeopardize another essential condition of its own possibility. So a social reproductive crisis, too, is large, or rather a tendency to social reproductive crisis is also lodged at the heart of capitalist society. And there's an analogous contradiction that dogs the relation in capitalist society between the economic and the political. On the one hand, a capitalist economy necessarily relies on a host of political supports, repressive security forces that contain dissent and enforce order, legal systems that guarantee private property and authorize accumulation, multiple public goods that enable private firms to operate profitably. Absent these political conditions, a capitalist economy could not exist. But capitalism's way of relating economy to polity is also self-destabilizing. Splitting off the private power of capital from the public power of states, this arrangement incentivizes the first to hollow out the second. Firms whose raison d'etre is endless accumulation have every reason to try to evade taxes, weaken regulation, privatize public goods, offshore their own operations, and thus to undermine the political prerequisites for their own existence. With the cannibal again primed to devour its own preconditions, a tendency to political crisis too is installed at the heart of capitalist society. So these are two further contradictions of capital, which also follow that 4D logic of division, dependence, disavowal, and destabilization. If you consider them in this light as analytical abstractions, they closely parallel the ecological contradiction I've dissected here. But that formulation misleads. The three contradictions do not, in fact, operate in parallel, but rather interact with one another and with the economic contradictions diagnosed by Marx. In fact, the interactions among them are so intimate, so mutually constitutive, that none of them can be fully understood in isolation from the others. So let's return briefly to the work of social reproduction, which is deeply concerned with matters of life and death. Care of children encompasses not only socialization, education, and emotional nurturance, but also gestation, birthing, postnatal tending to bodies, and ongoing physical protection. In the same way, care for the sick and the dying is focused on healing bodies and easing pain, as well as on providing solace and ensuring dignity. And everyone, young or old, sick or well, depends on care work to maintain shelter, nutrition, and sanitation for the sake of physical well-being as well as for social connection. What I'm saying then is that social reproductive work aims to sustain beings who are simultaneously natural and cultural. Confounding that very distinction, this work manages the interface of sociality and biology, community and habitat. So it's no surprise that social reproduction is intimately entwined with ecological reproduction, which is why so many crises of the first are also crises of the second, and why so many struggles over nature are also struggles over care and ways of life. When capital destabilizes the ecosystem that support human habitats, it simultaneously jeopardizes caregiving, as well as the livelihoods and social relations that sustain it. When people fight back, conversely, it is often to defend the entire eco-social nexus at a single stroke, as if to defy the authority of capital's institutional divisions. I think we eco-critical theorists should follow their example. We cannot adequately understand capitalism's ecological contradiction unless we think the latter together with its social reproductive contradiction. Although the system works to separate both nature and care from economy, it simultaneously sets in motion extensive interactions among them, and these deserve a prominent place in the eco-critical theory of capitalist society. The same point holds for the ecological and the political, which are also intimately linked in capitalist societies. It's, after all, public powers, usually states, that supply the legal and military might that enables capital to expropriate natural wealth gratis or on the cheap. And it is to public powers that people turn when ecological damages become so immediately threatening that they can no longer be ignored. It is states, in other words, that capitalist societies task with policing the boundary between economy and nature, with promoting or restraining development, with regulating or deregulating emissions, with deciding where to site toxic waste dumps, whether and how to mitigate their effect, whom to protect and whom to place in harm's way. So we can't hope to resolve the ecological crisis without also resolving the political crisis of our current form of capitalist society. The ecological is entangled finally with capital's constitutive division between exploitation and expropriation, a division that corresponds roughly to the global color line. This is a division that marks off populations whose social reproduction cost capital absorbs through the payment of wages from those whose labor and wealth it simply seizes without compensation. Whereas the first are positioned as free rights-bearing citizens able to access at least some level of political protection, the second are constituted as dependent or unfree subjects, enslaved or colonized in certain periods, unable to call on state protection, stripped of means of self-defense or actionable rights. Now, expropriation has also served as a method by which capital accesses energy and raw materials very cheaply, if not for free. The system develops and expands in part by annexing chunks of nature for whose reproduction it does not pay. In appropriating nature, however, capital simultaneously expropriates human communities for whom the confiscated materiel and befouled surrounds constitute a habitat, their means of livelihood, the material basis for their social reproduction. These communities thus bear a hugely disproportionate share of the global environmental load. Their expropriation affords other, shall we say, whiter communities the chance to be sheltered, at least for a while, from the worst effects of capital's cannibalization of nature. So the system's built-in tendency to ecological crisis is tightly linked to its built-in tendency to create racially marked populations for expropriation. In this case, too, an eco-critical theory cannot adequately understand the first apart from the second. All told then, and I'm coming to my conclusion, I realize we're running a bit late, but I'll wrap up very quickly. All told, capitalism's ecological contradiction cannot be neatly separated from the system's other constitutive irrationalities and injustices. To ignore the latter by adopting what I think of as the reductive ecologistic perspective of single issue environmentalism is to miss the distinctive institutional structure of capitalist societies. Dividing economy not only from nature, but also from state, care, and racial imperial expropriation, the society institutes a tangle of mutually interacting contradictions, which we must track together in a single frame. So my conclusion here is that eco-politics must be not only anti-capitalist, but also trans-environmental. Now that's a tall order, to be sure, But I'll conclude by suggesting that anti-capitalism and trans-environmentalism go together well in the current moment. This is a time, after all, of epochal crisis, a general crisis, a crisis of ecology, to be sure, but also one of economy, society, politics, and as we know very well, sitting where we are, public health. That is a general crisis whose effects metastasize everywhere, shaking confidence in established worldviews and ruling elites, hence therefore also a crisis of hegemony. In this situation, safeguarding the planet requires building a counter-hegemony, an eco-political common sense that can orient a broadly eco-societal transformation. This common sense must identify exactly what in society must be changed to stop global warming, but it must also transcend the merely environmental, if one can speak that way, addressing the full extent of our general crisis. It must connect its ecological diagnosis to other vital concerns, including livelihood insecurity, denial of labor rights, public disinvestment from social reproduction and chronic undervaluation of care work, ethno-racial imperial oppression and gender and sex domination, dispossession, expulsion, and exclusion of migrants, and so on. Far from treating global warming as a trump card that overrides everything else, a counter-hegemonic perspective must trace that threat to underlying societal dynamics that also drive other strands of the present crisis. Only by addressing all major facets of this crisis, environmental and non-environmental, and by disclosing the connections among them, can we envision a counter-hegemonic perspective, a counter-hegemonic block of political forces that backs a common project and possesses the political heft to pursue it effectively. That conclusion will gain some additional support when we shift the focus to history, as I intend to do in tomorrow's lecture, but that's all enough for today. Thank you very much for your attention and for honoring me with this wonderful visiting professorship and the inauguration of a terrific program that I know will continue brilliantly for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy Fraser, for this very exciting and dense presentation, analysis of our society, the current conjuncture we are living in. And we are, I assume many of us, looking forward to your presentation tomorrow and the way how you will close the argument. Time is running. There will be one round of questions that you, the audience, can ask from the internet. But before, there will be one more speaker, our commentator. It's Professor Attila Melegh. He's sociologist and historian, senior researcher at the Demographic Research Institute in Budapest and associate professor at Corvinus University in Budapest. His research interests and publications focus on international migration, population, discourses, and development dynamics in Central and Eastern Europe. He has lectured in Russia, United States, and Georgia, participated in several international research projects, and published extensively, including a publication with the current Austrian Minister of Education and Science, as I discovered in preparing for today. Professor Melegh is also the founding director of the Polanyi Research Center for Global Social Studies in Budapest, which has been very active in disseminating knowledge on Karl Polanyi. In 2019, it co-organized with the IKPS a large Karl Polanyi conference. Professor Melegh, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everybody, and it's an extreme privilege to sit and listen to Professor Fraser to this excellent inauguration lecture, to sit together with President Novy, Professor Kita, Professor Stagel, Aulenbacher, and I just can continue like this. It is also a great honor to sit with you and to think about such intellectuals like Polanyi, Karl Marx, Georg Lukács, Antonio Gramsci. What an excellent company we are sitting in. None of them are either or for me. They are together, on which it's a kind of a homeland where actually we can settle down. Now, I received these talks. I'm going to give a comment now. I got this talk 24 hours ago, which I read immediately, and gave me quite a food for thought for almost the full day. So when I'm doing this, please take that into account. So my comment would be the following. Professor Fraser clearly argues that capitalism is the principal socio-historical driver of the ecological crisis and not humanity as such. Capitalism does this not because of its internal system, as it uses society and environment as an externality. This robbing kills environment, kills social care, kills social texture, which is then dominated by the inherent logic of capital accumulation instead. The description of Professor Fraser is again a beautiful description of what Polanyi was referring to as the working of satanic mills. This is all correct, and capitalism is continuously reducing the chances of humanity to build up better exchanges with its environment and to assure the basic reproduction processes of our social and natural environment. She also argues very correctly that this supertension of capitalism is to be seen in its totality, in its all intersectional relationships, all included. But in addition to seeing what capitalism does to the environment and humanity, we also have to see what social factors do to capitalism historically, and not only from the point of view of opposing it or counterbalancing it. Of course, progressive, transformative, all-inclusive double movement is our hope. This is why we are sitting here. Most probably, this is why we are celebrating a new Polanyian institution set up by International Polanyi Society. But more analytically, and I think Professor Fraser was also referring to that's going to be maybe tomorrow's lecture, which I'm eager to listen to tomorrow. But more task is to be done to continue the excellent series of analysis of Professor Fraser. Are we not seeing historically interactions between humanity and capitalism which make us weaker in this struggle? Are not there some interactions in which almost involuntarily we promote further marketization of society? Yes, we do see such interactions. Professor Fraser, and now I focus on one aspect, social care, which was mentioned so beautifully during the talk of Professor Fraser. So Professor Fraser rightly puts much emphasis on social care and says the following, I quote, a tendency to social reproductive crisis is lodged at the very heart of capitalist society, the end of quote. It seems to me that this social satanic meal is becoming more and more destructive due to some historical dynamics related to processes started and promoted by earlier capitalism and the reaction of humanity to the earlier forms of capitalism. let me just give some ideas what I have in mind and why the analysis of Professor Fraser is super important. I would like to mention certain issues of political demography and related political economy, which unfortunately pushed toward further marketization, further into the satanic mills. Number one, first and foremost, population growth as related to the dramatic collapse of patriarchal agrarian systems existing till the 20th century, and now the dramatic decline of fertility and the coming up of ideas of commodified cost and benefit analysis and quality ideas of having children, promoted by capitalist biopolitical regimes, which in the end produce, and this is the point I'm trying to make here, a dramatic aging of human population. Second, this dramatic aging without the previously existing unequal and patriarchal peasant systems puts humanity and its elderly and its sick at the mercy of market and or state. Number three, the state has done little. Still, 4.5 billion people on Earth have no social security at all. And only the rich and privileged countries have elderly care systems with, of course, with their dramatic redistributive injustices, as pointed out by Professor Fraser in many of her writings, which is under strain in the current neoliberal competition. So only a few rich countries also involved in this dramatic neoliberal competition in trying to please global capital. These governments selectively and biopolitically promote the immigration of those who have no such system or whose systems are much weaker than theirs. Such privileged states, instead of building up local community care systems, all participating care systems, and counterbalancing the drive of capital, push for badly paid, gendered, defamiliarized, desocialized care migrants who leave behind uncared elderly and children. This is supermarketization on local and global levels, which leads to, unfortunately, to further marketization. This number 4 comes as an argument. The stagnation and decline of state redistribution and the complete lack of debt in many parts of the world pushes people to market solutions, private care funds, private savings in an amazingly unequal global society. With this, they are pushed at the mercy of financial markets, which look for further investment, for instance, in private care systems. This system operating on a global level in this manner, of course, pushes also people in other parts of the world for further migration, just in order to reach and get into the biopolitically selective, authoritarian, nationalist wars being built up by those privileged states toward them. This in all segments leads to further marketization, further and further, and this eats up society step by step and makes puts us into the mercy of capitalist states and the market. This ongoing trap situation, this ongoing marketization, and this is my last point as a comment, reminds me of the story of Jonas in the Old Testament. Jonas was asked to do some prophecy against the current practices of that society. Instead of that, Jonas wanted to avoid this struggle. He refrained from that, and as it is changed, he got into the whale. For me, this whale is this unfulfillable unending capital accumulation and marketization of society. Luckily, and thanks to Professor Fraser, we have arguments, we have lectures like today, which give us a rather clear guidance that there is no third way, either this system or another system, otherwise we are going to be eaten up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attila Melegh, for this rich comment. I ask you, Nancy, do you want to respond immediately, or shall I pose already one or the other question for you from the audience?
I mean, that was such a beautiful talk. I just want to thank Attila, and I'll be happy to, hear some other questions and maybe intersperse some other reflections on what he said. But thank you.
Fine, because then I'll take two questions that go in different directions. The first one is, what is the role of academia in combating environmental and social injustices? And the second one is already a strategic one. Perhaps you answer it tomorrow, but I'll ask the question anyhow. How accurate in diagnosis and strategical for mobilization is to put growth and development at the center of the critique of capitalism? Two substantial questions.
Andreas, before you leave, I'm not sure that I heard the first one. The role of what? Academia. The first one.
Academia, the university.
Academia.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Yes, and can you just give me a one-sentence version of the second one? I had a little trouble hearing you.
Oh, sorry. The second one is whether analytically and strategically it's good to put growth at the center stage of the critique.
Great. Okay, well, thank you both for the whoever asked these questions. Thank you. Well, the role of academia, I mean, I think, I think we are another arena, maybe not so much in Vienna, I hope not, but I can tell you that we in the United States in academia are another arena of exactly what Attila spoke about, of, a increasingly marketized, cannibalizing system where more and more of the research capacities are in private or quasi-private hands, corporations funding research, cutbacks at public universities that are very dire, an increasing amount of professorial labor is precarious. We don't have so many permanent tenured faculty positions anymore. So, I mean, I think we are seeing or have seen the neoliberalization of the universities. So that means in part that academics have to sort of fight right in our own terrain for the idea that knowledge is a public good and that education is a public good. It can't be the prerogative of the rich. It can't be turned into a profit-making enterprise. At the same time, many academics have political engagements in one or another with relations to various political parties or social movements, and try in their intellectual work to contribute to whatever it is, concept formation or empirical data and so on that could actually be useful. And speaking for myself, I see myself in a kind of dialogue. Maybe most of it's inside my own head, but anyway, I think of it as a dialogue with activists and social movements who have progressive or emancipatory agendas. And I see my own work as, trying to pick up on their insights, sometimes give them a conceptual form, or pointing out connections that between social struggles, and trying to nudge people to adopt a sort of larger perspective. So to create a kind of a map so people can find themselves on the social map and see who are their, who they should think of as their enemies and who their potential allies and so on. Anyway, that's one thing intellectuals or academics can do. Let me leave that at that. Now, the question of growth. My view is that the discourse of growth versus degrowth is not exactly helpful. It's a bit like the Anthropocene. It's not finely conceptualized. It glosses over important distinctions. In capitalism, what must grow is value, is capital, is surplus value. And that's what we certainly want to do, is stop this dynamism, this automatic imperative to grow capital. That's something we don't want to grow. But we might very well want to grow a lot of other things, like healthcare capacities or educational capacities, and so on and so forth. And some of that might involve increased material throughput. But the main point I want to make is that the question of what should grow or should not grow is a fundamentally political question. That question is now controlled by capital and the people who embody it. We want to take that question away from them and make it a question for democratic, society-wide consideration. So I think that sometimes we don't want to adopt a language, I would say, and here's where it becomes strategic, where the implication is that you're asking a large majority of, let's say, working people to think that they have to give up something. They are struggling. The last message they need to hear is, you have too much, you need less. So I think that properly understood, a kind of eco-socialist agenda, let's call it, would be one that is promising people more rich relationships, better healthcare, more, the things that we value more. So I don't like the degrowth language per se, and I think we don't want to muddy the waters. We want to talk about what must grow in capitalism and should not grow, and what is prevented from growing in capitalism, but we want to have grow. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I think 2 hours of virtual conversation is a very long time. Thank you all those who are still with us. I want to end asking a personal question for you, probably also interesting for other people. What do we expect from tomorrow's speech? Why, and in a nutshell, why should we listen and return watching you tomorrow?
So what I want to try to do tomorrow is really look a little bit both at the history of fossilization and the building of a world economy on a fossil fueled basis, but from the standpoint of environmental struggle. I want to try to, I'm going to be drawing a lot. Those of you who know the work of Joan Martinez Allier, he has a great book called The Environmentalism of the Poor. I've sort of, inverted that title to speak about the environmentalism of the rich. And I'm going to try to counterpose two environmentalisms. We could call them, you know, in a quasi-populist way, rich versus poor. And I want to show that standalone environmentalism that excludes all these other considerations that I've tried to bring in will necessarily be an environmentalism of the rich, or just as I tried to argue that a certain kind of feminism was the feminism of the 1%. So I'm going to try to argue for the environmentalism of the 99%, which is trans-environmental and anti-capitalist.
Thank you, thank you. I definitively will be there, Nancy, and I assume many others. We're coming to a close, and that implies very much in line what Nancy Fraser teaches us, not only looking at production, but also reproduction, not only looking at those talking and speaking, but also at the backstage. So I want to thank the professionals from Streamland for their very, very professional support and enabling this event technically. Roland Kiesling and Edith Schachinger. Thomas He from the city of Vienna for all the logistical support, and Melissa Erhard, Rada Pantelic from the International Karl Polanyi Society. Thank you very much for all of you. Thank you for all of you listening and watching, and I hope to see you tomorrow again. Have a nice, good afternoon, have a good evening. See you tomorrow.